Hello and welcome to IT Auditing with SK, your go-to resource for all things IT auditing. Welcome to part 2 of this video series where we are looking at some useful ChatGPT prompts when going through different stages of your IT audit using the example of IT general controls. And today in particular, we'll be looking at execution and some of the useful prompts that you'll likely use when executing or when performing your fieldwork. Right, and before we maybe get into that, a brief overview of what fieldwork or execution is. So, this is the phase where you'll be performing tests, gathering evidence, and identifying potential gaps in controls. And these are all activities that ChatGPT can assist with, specifically to help you perform those audit tasks and to help you stay organized. Now, let's take a look at some prompts that you can use. Starting off with this one right here. So just making it easy for myself, copy paste. ChatGPT, what questions should I ask during a walkthrough of user access management procedures? So really specific. You want to have an idea of the questions to ask, especially if you haven't performed a walkthrough yet, or if you haven't particularly performed a walkthrough in the access management space of controls. So here our results are coming through. So goes on to mention that when conducting a walkthrough of the user access management procedures, you should ask questions that cover policy, processes, security, compliance, operational effectiveness or efficiency. And here's a structured approach, really helpful. User access provisioning, authentication, authorization, user access reviewing and monitoring, user access removal, privileged access, segregation of duties, logging and auditing. The list goes on. I see there a little bit of incident management wouldn't typically fall into the user access management bit. However, it's been included here, and that's why you then need to sense check and see if it follows with your expectation, your methodology, and so forth. And I'll probably just pick on one of these, maybe privileged access management. So the questions themselves, how are privileged accounts, e.g. root, admin, super user managed? So you then get some kind of explanation on how they're managed. Are the passwords stored in a maybe a password tool? Are there processes to retrieve those passwords? That's what they might explain. And what security measures protect privileged accounts? So similar to what I just mentioned, password vaulting, just-in-time access. Is privileged access monitored and logged? Then they tell you how they do that. And then how do you mitigate insider threats related to privileged access? So it's really good questions that will help you get a start on the process. And one of the key things, there is a training that I did on how to perform a walkthrough. And I did mention in that you should try to ask questions like who, what, where, how, and you'll see some of those in here. So that questioning, that line of questioning, can we see this? Are these, open-ended questions that will get you a really good response? And if you watched our first part or the first part where we talked about planning, again here, same thing. If you'd like a checklist or a specific format, then you can request for that and it will be provided as output, right? Now, let's say you're now actually testing the IT general control. So again, another really specific prompt, right? How should I test the effectiveness of password policies in an organization? Right, very broad, but really useful if you've never tested password policies at all. So here it gives you some steps that you can take, and we'll just let it generate that. But obviously, starting point would be assessing the policy itself. So do they have a policy on what passwords should be set to? And you get your technical configuration. So now you're checking what they have in the policies is what they've actually configured on the relevant applications or systems. And then also just checking in terms of best practice and against regulation. So what does certain standards say about password policies, especially if that organization says that they have documented their policies following a certain standard. So you would expect that it's in line with that. So just checking if the policies are in compliance with certain standards. And yeah, we also have here another point confirming audit logging is in place for password related events. Really key. So some really good suggestions are coming through here. Next thing, conduct password audits, strength analysis. You may not need to do this for an IT general controls. This is really like deep, deep, deep type of controls now. You may actually only need to stop at step one, but depends with the depth of your audit, depends with your risk assessment and any other factors that you are considering. And yeah, this really would be also useful if you were, oh yeah, I see why. Okay, that makes sense. Because I'm seeing the response here and I'm thinking this is a little bit beyond IT general controls, but this is now just encompassing passwords in general. So if you were reviewing passwords, maybe not just IT general controls, maybe you're doing a cyber related audit, you're actually really wanting to know the nitty gritties of passwords, then that's why you have these additional steps. So not only useful for ITGCs, any IT audit that you're going to perform, really, really useful, right? And some recommendations, right? Really useful. Again, checklist format, also good if you want to export, turn it into like an ongoing sort of work paper related thing. So that's another prompt there. The other thing that you tend to do, so now we've covered a prompt for walkthrough, for testing, and now we've got an example coming up where we are collecting evidence, which is really important. As you know, whatever work that you perform needs to be supported by sufficient and appropriate evidence. So here, ChatGPT, what documentation should I collect to support IT general controls testing on change management controls, right? At high level, it says evidence should demonstrate how changes to IT systems are requested, approved, developed, tested, implemented, monitored, and below is the structured approach of documentation you can follow, right, to gather evidence. So change management policies and procedures, that's some of the evidence that you get. And then you've got change requests and approval documentation, change development and testing documentation, deployment, implementation, compliance and audit reports, tools that will help you in collecting that evidence. So we've got some IT service management systems like ServiceNow, Jira. We've got version control systems, GitHub, Azure DevOps. We've got change deployment tools, Jenkins, Puppet, Terraform, and we've got some security and compliance tools, maybe for retrieval of passwords, for example, to ensure segregation of duties. There may need to be some retrieval of a password to allow a developer to move changes into production, something of that sort. So they may use things like Splunk, Sentinel, and so forth. So this would be really, really helpful. It will give you a really good idea of the evidence that you need to collect and where you might need to collect it from. So that's another prompt now covering evidence collection. And again, there's something called professional skepticism. And it's like your muscle to question things, right? So you don't just take things at face value. And this is something that grows the more and more you are experienced in IT audits, right? But if you're starting off, then you may not know how to spot some red flags. So you're still growing that professional skepticism muscle, but you can help yourself with ChatGPT using the prompt that we have here. So, what are common red flags or control deficiencies I should look out for in access control reviews? So really good. You are reviewing access controls, reviews. Everything looks fine, but maybe you have an inkling that something may not be quite correct, right? And really, I'll say it's not uncommon if you don't have experience in a certain area. It's not uncommon that you can actually document and see absolutely nothing wrong with the controls that you'll be reviewing. But someone else a little bit more experienced might come up with like five deficiencies from that whole process. So it's really not uncommon. But you can help yourself here by being at least aware of some of the deficiencies or issues or findings you may see within specific IT general controls areas. So here, using the example of access control reviews, number one, under user access provisioning, we have unauthorized user access, right? So especially a really good example here, employees or contractors who have access and they've never requested for that access, or it was requested but never approved and somehow they've got access. Typical with contractors, sometimes they need things to get done and then circumvent the processes that are in place. Another one, new hires are automatically assigned high privileges without justification. So those are some of the red flags that you need to look out for. And you can even pick this when you're doing your walkthrough. So your client auditee might just mention, oh, everyone who comes to this organization, we just give them access. Then you're like, okay, what's the basis of giving that access? How do you know what access to give them? They'll be like, oh, we don't know, we just give them access, right? So you need to then build that muscle that we were talking about. And we've got excessive privilege, so users retaining old permission after job role changes. So someone has changed their job 5 times, been promoted, moved teams, and they continue to retain access that they had in their previous role. And over time, they just have a whole lot of this access. We've got weak or inconsistent approval processes, and yeah, poor authentication and authorization control, some red flags there. User access review failures, some other red flags as well. And privileged access deficiencies, too many privileged users, no segregation of duties, no monitoring of privileged user usage, weak passwords, and credential management. So, really, this is a comprehensive list, and this is exactly what you'll find across different environments. So, again, you don't need to have 5 years of experience before you start picking these things up. If you do a little bit of reading, if you do a little bit of research, even if you are just preparing for your audit, like you're probably doing now, having an awareness of these observations or findings could be really useful, right? And there's some recommended action plans for fixing control deficiencies there. If you are an auditor, then you may recommend, so it's like a suggestion. You don't really force people to then implement the control. You may recommend to say, actually, you should, in light of this finding, you may need to do this, right? Cool. So that's really one of the key prompts that you may use just to build that reserve of common red flags and deficiencies. And lastly, a key thing or a key activity that you perform when you are executing the IT general control or performing your field work, which is the documentation itself. So, how should I document evidence? And here we have an example of backup and recovery procedures. Really important. Right. So, here again, structured approach for collecting and documenting evidence. And in terms of suggestions, here we've got documenting your policy, what you've observed in the policy, the SOPs, the data retention policy, backup testing. So it gives you sort of an idea of some of the details you need to include in your documentation. Again, here we've got some suggestions of evidence that you need to include in your documentation. So if we look at the backup job schedule and logs, screenshots or reports showing configured backup schedules, log files confirming scheduled backups completed successfully, reports of failed backups, root cause analysis, and corrective actions. Really useful stuff. And right, here's another one: access controls and audit logs for backup systems. So, list of users with administrator access to backup management systems, screenshots of access control settings and backup solutions, all useful suggestions. And we even have a checklist here of the areas that you need to review. And like I always mention, you can draft this into a template for documenting ITGCs. And actually, let's see what that produces for us. Right, really good. It's coming up now. Okay, so we've got a good template actually. So it's got some general information. So who's performing the review, who's the reviewer, department, system application, backup solution used, any regulatory compliance requirements, and then section 2, backup policy is documented. So you're just saying yes, there's a policy, or no, there's no policy. Really good. Executing and monitoring, so evidence collected and so forth. Backup and restoration, so it's broken it down by the different stages we saw in the previous prompt. Summary of findings, and then reviewer signature. Or so this is really, really useful. And I always mention that if you are within in maybe let's say a big four firm, you may not appreciate just the effort that needs to go into actually coming up with a template, a work paper. So this is really a good place to start. And that would wrap up our session, especially around the execution or field work. And hopefully those prompts that we discussed will give you a good starting point when you then perform your IT general controls review. I hope you found this useful. I'll see you in the next video when we talk about reporting and how you can use ChatGPT to make sure that you are producing a good report, and a report that your stakeholders can understand, and a report that also really conveys what you observed and the key recommendations. So I'll see you in that next video.